Chapter 23 from Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, Chapter 23. In his letter of January 4, General Scott had promised Mr. Lincoln that from time to time he would keep him informed of the situation of military affairs. This promise the general failed to redeem, probably not through any intentional neglect, but more likely because, in the first place, Buchanan's policy of delay, indecision, and informal negotiation with the conspirators left everything in uncertainty. And secondly, because the attention of the administration and measurably of the whole country was turned to hopes of compromise, especially through the labors of the Peace Convention. The rebels, on their part, were absorbed in the formation of the provisional government at Montgomery. Lincoln was making his memorable journey from Springfield to Washington by way of the chief cities of the North. The Fort Pickens truce was practically a secret, and thus the military status was for the time being lost sight of beyond the immediate neighborhood of Charleston. Since the reorganization of Buchanan's cabinet on December 31 and the expulsion or defection of traitors from the departments and from Congress, the whole North had breathed somewhat easier. The firing on the Star of the West had created a storm of indignation, but this too quickly subsided, and by a sort of common consent all parties and sections looked to the incoming administration as the only power which could solve the national crisis. The keynote of such a solution was given in the inaugural of the new president. This announced a decided, though not a violent, change of policy. Buchanan's course had been one professedly of conciliation, but practically of ruinous concession. Lincoln, receiving from his hands the precious trust of the government, not in its original integrity, but humbled, impaired, diminished, and threatened, announced his purpose of conciliation, conservation, and restoration. The policy chosen, said he, looked to the exhaustion of all peaceful measures before a resort to any stronger ones. It sought only to hold the public places and property not already wrested from the government, and to collect the revenue, relying for the rest on time, discussion, and the ballot box. It promised a continuance of the mails at government expense to the very people who were resisting the government, and it gave repeated pledges against any disturbance to any of the people or any of their rights. Of all that which a president might constitutionally and justifiably do in such a case, everything was forborne without which it was believed possible to keep the government on foot. This specific purpose was now, however, destined to receive a rude shock. When on the morning of the 5th of March Lincoln went to his office in the Executive Mansion, he found a letter from Mr. Holt, still acting as Secretary of War, giving him news of vital importance received on the morning of the inauguration, namely that Fort Sumter must, in the lapse of a few weeks at most, be strongly reinforced or summarily abandoned. Major Anderson had in the previous week made an examination of his provisions. There was bread for 28 days, pork for a somewhat longer time, beans, rice, coffee, and sugar for different periods from 8 to 40 days. He had at the same time consulted his officers on the prospects and possibilities of relief and reinforcement. They unanimously reported that before Sumter could be permanently or effectively succored, a combined land and naval force must attack and carry the besieging forts and batteries and hold the secession militia at bay, and that such an undertaking would at once concentrate at Charleston all the volunteers, not alone of South Carolina, but of the adjacent States as well. I confess, wrote Anderson, transmitting the reports and estimates of his 9 officers, that I would not be willing to risk my reputation on an attempt to throw reinforcements into this harbor within the time for our relief rendered necessary by the limited supply of our provisions, and with a view of holding possession of the same with a force of less than 20,000 good and well-disciplined men. Mr. Holt, quoting from previous instructions to and reports from the Major, added that this declaration takes the department by surprise, as his previous correspondence contained no such intimation. Retrospective criticism as to why or how such a state of things had been permitted to grow up was, of course, useless. Here was a most portentous complication, not of Lincoln's own creating, but which he must nevertheless meet and overcome. He had counted on the soothing aid of time. Time, on the contrary, was in this emergency working in the interest of rebellion. General Scott was at once called into council, but his sagacity and experience could afford neither suggestion nor encouragement. That same night he returned the papers to the President with a somewhat lengthy endorsement, reciting the several events which led to, and his own personal efforts to avert, this contingency, but ending with the gloomy conclusion, "Evacuation seems almost inevitable, and in this view our distinguished Chief Engineer, Brigadier Totten, concurs, if indeed the worn-out garrison be not assaulted and carried in the present week." This was a disheartening, almost a disastrous beginning for the administration. The Cabinet had only that day been appointed and confirmed. The Presidential advisers had not yet taken their posts. All had not even signified their acceptance. There was an impatient multitude clamoring for audience, and behind these swarmed an army of office seekers. Everything was urgency and confusion. Everywhere was ignorance of method and routine. Rancor and hatred filled the breasts of political opponents departing from power. Suspicion and rivalry possessed partisan adherents seeking advantage and promotion. As yet, Lincoln virtually stood alone, face to face with the appalling problems of the present and the threatening responsibilities of the future. Doubtless in this juncture he remembered and acted upon a biblical precedent which in after days of trouble and despondency he was wont to quote for justification or consolation. When the children of Israel murmured on the shore of the Red Sea, Moses told them to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Here, at the very threshold of his presidential career, Lincoln had need to practice the virtue of patience, one of the cardinal elements of his character, acquired in many a personal and political tribulation. He referred the papers back to General Scott to make a more thorough investigation of all the questions involved. At the same time, he gave him a verbal order touching his future policy, which a few days later was reduced to writing, and on the installation of the new Secretary of War, transmitted by that functionary to the General-in-Chief through the regular official channels, as follows: I am directed by the President to say he desires you to exercise all possible vigilance for the maintenance of all the places within the military department of the United States, and to promptly call upon all the departments of the government for the means necessary to that end. On the 9th of March, in written questions, Lincoln, in substance, asked General Scott to inform him, first, to what point of time can Anderson maintain his position in Sumter? Second, can you, with present means, relieve him within that time? Third, what additional means would enable you to do so? This was on Saturday following the inauguration. The chiefs of the several departments, with the exception of Cameron, Secretary of War, had been during the week inducted into office. That night the President held his first Cabinet Council on the state of the country, and the crisis at Sumter with the question of relieving the fort were for the first time communicated to his assembled advisers. The general effect was one of dismay, if not consternation. For such a discussion, all were unprepared. Naturally, all decision must be postponed, and the assistance of professional advice be sought. What followed has been written down by an eyewitness and participant. March 9, 1861, Saturday night, a Cabinet Council upon the state of the country. I was astonished to be informed that Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor must be evacuated, and that General Scott, General Totten, and Major Anderson concur in opinion that as the place has but 28 days' provision, it must be relieved, if at all, in that time, and that it will take a force of 20,000 men at least, and a bloody battle to relieve it. For several days after this, consultations were held as to the feasibility of relieving Fort Sumter, at which were present, explaining and aiding, General Scott, General Totten, Commodore Stringham, and Mr. Fox, who seems to be au fait in both nautical and military matters. The Army officers and Navy officers differ widely about the degree of danger to rapid-moving vessels passing under the fire of land batteries. The Army officers think destruction almost inevitable, where the Navy officers think the danger but slight. The one believe that Sumter cannot be relieved, not even provisioned, without an army of 20,000 men and a bloody battle. The other, the naval, believe that with light, rapid vessels they can cross the bar at high tide of a dark night, run the enemy's forts, Moultrie and Cummings Point, and reach Sumter with little risk. They say that the greatest danger will be in landing at Sumter, upon which point there may be a concentrated fire. They do not doubt that the place can be and ought to be relieved. Mr. Fox is anxious to risk his life in leading the relief, and Commodore Stringham seems equally confident of success. The naval men have convinced me fully that the thing can be done, and yet as the doing of it would be almost certain to begin the war, and as Charleston is of little importance as compared with the chief points in the Gulf, I am willing to yield to the military council and evacuate Fort Sumter, at the same time strengthening the forts in the Gulf so as to look down opposition and guarding the coast with all our naval power, if need be, so as to close any port at pleasure. And to this effect, I gave the President my written opinion on the 16th of March. This extract from the diary of Edward Bates, the Attorney General in the new administration, shows us the drift and scope of the official discussions on the Sumter question. To understand its full bearings, however, we must examine it a little more specifically. The idea of the evacuation and abandonment of the fort was so repugnant that Mr. Lincoln could scarcely bring himself to entertain it. We have his own forcible statement of how the apparently crushing necessity presented itself to his mind. General Scott, on March 11 and 12, made written replies to the questions the President had propounded and submitted the draft of an order for evacuation. He believed Anderson could, in respect to provisions, hold out some 40 days without much suffering, but that the assailants, having overpowering numbers, could easily wear out the garrison by a succession of pretended night attacks, and when ready, take it easily by a single real assault. To supply or reinforce the fort successfully, he should need a fleet of war vessels and transports, which it would take 4 months to collect, and besides 5,000 regulars and 20,000 volunteers, which it would require new acts of Congress to authorize, and from 6 to 8 months to raise, organize, and discipline. It is therefore my opinion and advice, wrote Scott, that Major Anderson be instructed to evacuate the fort so long gallantly held by him and his companions immediately on procuring suitable water transportation, and that he embark with his command for New York. In a purely military point of view, says Lincoln, this reduced the duty of the administration in the case to the mere matter of getting the garrison safely out of the fort. It was believed, however, that to so abandon that position, under the circumstances, would be utterly ruinous, that the necessity under which it was to be done would not be fully understood, that by many it would be construed as a part of a voluntary policy, that at home it would discourage the friends of the Union, embolden its adversaries, and go far to ensure to the latter a recognition abroad, that in fact it would be our national destruction consummated. This could not be allowed. The dire alternative presented caused a thorough reexamination and discussion of the various plans of relief which had been suggested, and since the Army and the Navy showed some considerable disagreement in opinions, these discussions were held before the President and Cabinet in the Executive Council chamber itself. General Scott's first impulse had been to revive and recognize the Ward expedition prepared about the middle of February, which was to have consisted of several small Coast Survey steamers. To this end, he called Captain Ward to Washington and again discussed the plan. But considering the increase of batteries and channel obstructions, it was now by both of them pronounced impracticable. One other offer seemed worthy of consideration. This was the plan proposed by Gustavus V. Fox, a gentleman 39 of age, who had been 19 years in the United States Navy, had been engaged in the survey of the southern coast, had commanded United States mail steamers, and had resigned from the Navy in 1856 to engage in civil pursuits. He was a brother-in-law of the new Postmaster General Blair, who seconded his project with persistence. He had made his proposal to General Scott early in February, and, backed by prominent New York merchants and shippers, urged it as he best might through the whole of that month. In his various communications, Captain Fox thus described his plan. I propose to put the troops on board of a large, comfortable sea steamer and hire 2 or 3 powerful light draft New York tugboats, having the necessary stores on board. These to be convoyed by the United States steamer Pawnee, now at Philadelphia, and the revenue cutter Harriet Lane. Arriving off the bar at Charleston, I propose to examine by day the naval preparations and obstructions. If their vessels determine to oppose our entrance, and a feint or flag of truce would ascertain this, the armed ships must approach the bar and destroy or drive them on shore. Major Anderson would do the same upon any vessels within the range of his guns, and would also prevent any naval succor being sent down from the city. Having dispersed this force, the only obstacles are the forts on Cummings Point and Fort Moultrie, and whatever adjacent batteries they may have erected, distant on either hand from mid-channel about 3/4 of a mile. At night, 2 hours before high water, with half of the force on board of each tug, within relieving distance of each other, I should run in to Fort Sumter. These tugs are sea boats, 6 feet draft, speed 14 knots. The boilers are below, with 3½ feet space on each side to be filled with coal. The machinery comes up between the wheelhouses with a gangway on either hand of 5 or 6 feet, enabling us to pack the machinery with 2 or 3 thicknesses of bales of cotton or hay. This renders the vulnerable parts of the steamer proof against grape and fragments of shells, but the momentum of a solid shot would probably move the whole mass and disable the engine. The men are below, entirely protected from grape, provisions on deck. The first tug to lead in empty to open the enemy's fire, the other 2 to follow, with the force divided, and towing the large iron boats of the Baltic, which would hold the whole force should every tug be disabled, and empty they would not impede the tugs. The feasibility of Captain Fox's plan thus rested upon his ability to run the batteries, and on this point the main discussion now turned. As recorded in the diary we have quoted, the Army officers believed destruction almost inevitable, while the naval officers thought a successful passage might be effected. Captain Fox, who had come to Washington, finally argued the question in person before the President, Cabinet, and assembled military officers, adducing the recorded evidence of examples and incidents which had occurred in the Crimean War and the results of Dahlgren's experiments in firing at stationary targets, maintaining that there was no certainty whatever, and even only a minimum of chance, that land batteries could hit a small object moving rapidly at right angles to their line of fire at a distance of 1,300 yards, especially at night. So far as mere theory could do it, he successfully demonstrated his plan, convincing the President and at least a majority of the Cabinet against the objections of General Scott and his subordinate officers. Nevertheless, the political question, the more important of the two, yet remained to be considered. Resolved on prudent deliberation, President Lincoln now, on March 15, asked the written answer of his constitutional advisers to the following inquiry: assuming it to be possible to now provision Fort Sumter under all the circumstances, is it wise to attempt it? As requested, the members of the Cabinet returned somewhat elaborate replies setting forth their reasons and conclusions. Two of them, Chase and Blair, agreeing with the President's own inclinations, responded in the affirmative. The five others, Seward, Cameron, Wells, Smith, and Bates, advised against the measure. "I have not reached my own conclusion," wrote Chase, "without much difficulty. If the proposed enterprise will so influence civil war as to involve an immediate necessity for the enlistment of armies and the expenditure of millions, I cannot, in the existing circumstances of the country and in the present condition of the national finances, advise it." He argued, however, that an immediate proclamation of reasons and the manifestation of a kind and liberal spirit towards the South would avert such a result, and he would therefore return an affirmative answer. Blair had been from the first in favor of prompt and vigorous measures against the insurrection. A Democrat of the Jackson school, he would repeat Jackson's policy against nullification. He had brought forward and urged the scheme of Captain Fox. By the connivance of Buchanan's administration, he argued, the rebellion had been permitted unchecked to grow into an organized government in 7 states. It had been treated practically as a lawful proceeding, and if allowed to continue, all Southern people must become reconciled to it. The rebels believed Northern men deficient in courage to maintain the government. The evacuation of Sumter would convince them that the administration lacked firmness. Sumter, reinforced, would become invulnerable and would completely demoralize the rebellion. No expense or care should be spared to achieve this result. The appreciation of our stocks would reimburse the most lavish outlay for this purpose. You should give no thought for the commander and his comrades in this enterprise. They willingly take the hazard for the sake of the country, and the honor which, successful or not, they will receive from you and the lovers of free government in all lands. Seward, in the negative, argued the political issue at great length. To attempt to provision Sumter would provoke combat and open civil war. A desperate and defeated majority in the South had organized revolutionary government in 7 states. The other slave states were balancing between sympathy for the seceders and loyalty to the Union, but indicated a disposition to adhere to the latter. The Union must be maintained peaceably if it could, forcibly if it must, to every extremity. But civil war was the most uncertain and fearful of all remedies for political disorders. He would save the Union by peaceful policy without civil war. Disunion was without justification. Devotion to the Union was a profound and permanent national sentiment. Silenced by terror, it would, if encouraged, rally and reverse the popular action of the seceding states. The policy of the time was conciliation. Sumter was practically useless. I would not provoke war in any way now. I would resort to force to protect the collection of the revenue, because this is a necessary as well as a legitimate Union object. Even then it should be only a naval force that I would employ for that necessary purpose, while I would defer military action on land until a case should arise when we would hold the defense. In that case, we should have the spirit of the country and the approval of mankind on our side. Cameron followed the reasoning of the Army officers. Captain Fox, he said, did not propose to supply provisions for more than 1 or 2 months. The abandonment of Sumter seemed an inevitable necessity, and therefore the sooner the better. Wells thought the public mind was becoming reconciled to the idea of evacuation as a necessity. The strength, dignity, and character of the government would not be promoted by a successful attempt, while a failure would be disastrous. Smith argued that Sumter was not essential to any of the duties imposed on the government. There were other and more effective means to vindicate its honor and compel South Carolina to obey the laws. Bates believed the hazard greater than the gain. True, wrote he, war already exists by the act of South Carolina, but this government has thus far magnanimously forborne to retort the outrage, and I am willing to forbear yet longer in the hope of a peaceful solution of our present difficulties. Pickens, Key West, etc., should, on the contrary, be strongly defended, and the whole coast from South Carolina to Texas be guarded by the entire power of the Navy. Against the advice of so decided a majority, Lincoln did not deem it prudent to order the proposed expedition. Neither did his own sense of duty permit him entirely to abandon it. Postponing, therefore, a present final decision of the point, he turned his attention to the investigation of the question immediately and vitally connected with it, the collection of the revenue. On the 18th of March, he directed written inquiries to 3 of his cabinet officers, to the Attorney General, whether, under the Constitution and laws, the executive has power to collect duties on shipboard offshore; to the Secretary of the Treasury, whether and where and for what cause any importations are taking place without payment of duties; whether vessels offshore could prevent such importations or enforce payment; and what number and description of vessels besides those already in the revenue service; to the Secretary of the Navy, what amount of naval force he could place at the control of the revenue service, and how much additional in the future. Pending the receipt of replies to these inquiries, Lincoln determined to obtain information on 2 other points. The first, as to the present actual condition and feeling of Major Anderson; the second, as to the real temper and intentions of the people of Charleston. Captain Fox had suggested the possibility of obtaining leave to visit Sumter through the influence of Captain Hartstein, then in the rebel service at Charleston, but who had in former years been his intimate friend and comrade in command of a companion steamer of the California line. By order of the President, General Scott therefore sent him to obtain accurate information in regard to the command of Major Anderson in Fort Sumter. As Fox anticipated, Hartstein introduced him to Governor Pickens, to whom he showed his order, and having meanwhile had an interview with General Beauregard, was, after some delay, permitted to go to the fort under Hartstein's escort. He reported: "We reached Fort Sumter after dark, March 21, and I remained about 2 hours. Major Anderson seemed to think it was too late to relieve the fort by any other means than by landing an army on Morris Island. He agreed with General Scott that an entrance from the sea was impossible, but as we looked out upon the water from the parapet, It seemed very feasible, more especially as we heard the oars of a boat near the fort, which the sentry hailed, but we could not see her through the darkness until she almost touched the landing. I found the garrison getting short of supplies, and it was agreed that I might report that the 15th of April at noon would be the period beyond which the fort could not be held unless supplies were furnished. I made no arrangements with Major Anderson for reinforcing or supplying the fort, nor did I inform him of my plan. Unlike Fox, Anderson was in no wise encouraged by the conversation, and wrote, "I have examined the point alluded to by Mr. Fox last night. A vessel lying there will be under the fire of 13 guns from Fort Moultrie, and Captain Foster says that at the Pan Coupe, or immediately on its right, the best place for her to land. She would require, even at high tide, if drawing 10 feet, a staging of 40 feet. The department can decide what the chances will be of a safe debarkation and unloading at that point under these circumstances." The other point on which the President sought information revealed equally decisive features. It so happened that S.A. Hurlbut of Illinois, afterwards Major General of Volunteers, a personal friend of Lincoln, was at the moment in Washington. This gentleman was of Charleston birth, 4 years a law student of the foremost citizen and jurist of South Carolina, James L. Pettigrew, and then in frequent correspondence with him. On March 21, the President called Mr. Hurlbut to him, and explaining that Mr. Seward insisted that there was a strong Union party in the South, even in South Carolina, asked him to go personally and ascertain the facts. Mr. Hurlbut telegraphed his sister in Charleston that he was coming on a visit, which, in the threatening aspect of affairs, he might not soon be able to repeat. He traveled as a private citizen, though purposely with some show of publicity. Curiosity, however, centered itself upon his traveling companion, Ward H. Lamon, who, coming with an ostensible government mission to examine some post office matters, was looked upon as the real presidential messenger, was treated to a formal audience with the governor, and permitted to make a visit to Fort Sumter. While Lamon was hobnobbing with the young secessionists at the Charleston Hotel, Hurlbut, quartered at the house of his sister, and thus free from the inquisitive scrutiny of newspaper reporters, was quietly visiting his former neighbors and friends in various walks of life, and being visited by them. Of greater value than all was his confidential interview with his former legal preceptor. Mr. Pettigrew was at that time the best lawyer in the South and the strongest man in the State of South Carolina so far as character, ability, and purity went, and he never surrendered nor disguised his Union convictions. Mr. Hurlbut was himself an able lawyer, a man of experience and force in politics, and a shrewd and sagacious judge of human nature. His mission remained entirely unsuspected, and after 2 days' sojourn he returned to Washington and made a long written report to the President. By appointment, I met Mr. Pettigrew at 1 p.m. and had a private conversation with him for more than 2 hours. I was at liberty to state to him that my object was to ascertain and report the actual state of feeling in the city and State. Our conversation was entirely free and confidential. He is now the only man in the city of Charleston who avowedly adheres to the Union. From these sources, I have no hesitation in reporting as unquestionable that separate nationality is a fixed fact, that there is an unanimity of sentiment which is to my mind astonishing, that there is no attachment to the Union. There is positively nothing to appeal to. The sentiment of national patriotism, always feeble in Carolina, has been extinguished and overridden by the acknowledged doctrine of the paramount allegiance to the State. False political economy, diligently taught for years, has now become an axiom, and merchants and businessmen believe and act upon the belief that great growth of trade and expansion of material prosperity will and must follow the establishment of a Southern republic. They expect a golden era when Charleston shall be a great commercial emporium and control for the South as New York does for the North. These visits to Charleston added two very important factors to the problem from which the Cabinet and chiefly the President were to deduce the unknown. Very unexpectedly to the latter, and no doubt to all the former as well, a new light was now suddenly thrown upon the complicated question. The fate of Sumter had been under general discussion nearly 3 weeks. The Cabinet and the high military and naval officers had divided in opinion and separated into opposing camps. As always happens in such cases, suspicion and criticism of personal motives began to develop themselves, though at this very beginning, as throughout his whole after administration, they were held in check by the generous faith and unvarying impartiality of the President. Hitherto the sole issue was the relief or abandonment of Sumter, but now, by an apparent change of advice and attitude on the part of General Scott, the fate of Fort Pickens was also drawn into discussion. So far as is known, the loyalty and devotion of General Scott never wavered for an instant, but his proneness to mingle political with military considerations had already been twice manifested. The first was when, in his memorial entitled Views, etc., addressed to President Buchanan, October 29, 1860, he suggested the formation of 4 new American unions if the old should be dismembered. The second was more recent. On the day preceding Lincoln's inauguration, the general had written a letter to Seward. In this, he advanced the opinion that the new president would have to choose one of 4 plans or policies. First, to adopt the Crittenden Compromise and change the Republican to a Union party. Second, by closing or blockading rebel ports or collecting the duties on shipboard outside. Third, conquer the states by invading armies, which he deprecated. And fourth, say to the seceded states, wayward sisters, depart in peace. It must be noted that between 3 of these alternatives he gives no intimation of preference. The letter was simply a sign of the prevailing political unrest, and therefore remained unnoticed by the President to whom it was referred. When Lincoln assumed the duties of government, Scott had, among other things, briefly pointed out the existing danger at Fort Pickens, and the President, by his verbal order of March 5, directing all possible vigilance for maintenance of all the places, had intended that the stronghold should be promptly reinforced. He made inquiries on this head 4 days later, and to his surprise found nothing yet done. Hence he put his order in writing and sent it to the War Department for record March 11, and once more gave special directions in regard to Pickens, assuming the omission had occurred through preoccupation about Sumter. Upon this reminder, Scott bestirred himself, and at his instance the war steamer Mohawk was dispatched March 12, carrying a messenger with orders to Captain Bogdas to land his company at Fort Pickens and increase the garrison. Both President and Cabinet had since then considered that point disposed of for the moment. On the evening of March 28, the first state dinner was given by the new occupants of the Executive Mansion. Just before the hour of leave-taking, Lincoln invited the members of his Cabinet into an adjoining room for a moment's consultation. And when they were alone, he informed them with evident emotion that General Scott had that day advised the evacuation of Fort Pickens as well as Fort Sumter. The general's recommendation was formulated as follows in his written memorandum to the Secretary of War. It is doubtful, however, according to recent information from the South, whether the voluntary evacuation of Fort Sumter alone would have a decisive effect upon the States now wavering between adherence to the Union and secession. It is known, indeed, that it would be charged to necessity, and the holding of Fort Pickens would be adduced in support of that view. Our Southern friends, however, are clear that the evacuation of both the forts would instantly soothe and give confidence to the 8 remaining slaveholding states and render their cordial adherence to this union perpetual. The holding of Forts Jefferson and Taylor on the ocean keys depends on entirely different principles and should never be abandoned. and indeed the giving up of Fort Sumter and Pickens may be best justified by the hope that we should thereby recover the States to which they geographically belong by the liberality of the act, besides retaining the 8 doubtful States. A long pause of blank amazement followed the President's recital, broken at length by Blair in strong denunciation, not only of this advice, but of Scott's general course regarding Sumter. He charged that Scott was transcending his professional duties and playing politician. Blair's gestures and remarks, moreover, were understood by those present as being aimed specially at Seward, whose peace policy he had, with his usual impulsive aggressiveness, freely criticized. Without any formal vote, there was a unanimous expression of dissent from Scott's suggestion, and under the President's request to meet in formal council next day, the Cabinet retired. That night Lincoln's eyes did not close in sleep. It was apparent that the time had come when he must meet the nation's crisis. His judgment alone must guide, his sole will determine, his own lips utter the word that should save or lose the most precious inheritance of humanity, the last hope of free government on the earth. Only the imagination may picture that intense and weary vigil. End of chapter 23.